The acrid smell of gasoline filled Detective Marcus Kane's nostrils as orange flames erupted across his police uniform, the fire spreading with terrifying speed up his chest. His screams echoed through the abandoned warehouse as three silhouettes watched from the shadows, their police badges glinting in the hellish light. The very men he had once called brothers were now his executioners, and the evidence that could have brought down the entire precinct was turning to ash along with his flesh. But this moment of ultimate betrayal had been months in the making. 6 months earlier, Detective Marcus Kane had always believed in the thin blue line. 22 years on the force, commendations covering his office wall, and a reputation for being incorruptible in a city where corruption flowed like water through cracked pavement. At 45, Marcus still possessed the idealism that had driven him to become a cop straight out of college, despite watching cynicism consume most of his colleagues over the years. His father had been a cop too, Officer Daniel Kane, killed in the line of duty when Marcus was just 16. The funeral had been massive, with hundreds of officers from across the state forming honor guards and playing bagpipes. That day, watching his father's flag-draped coffin being carried by 6 men in dress blues, Marcus had made a promise to himself. He would carry on his father's legacy of service and integrity. The promise had shaped every decision Marcus made for the next 3 decades. He'd turned down lucrative offers from private security firms, refused bribes from grateful suspects, and never once compromised his principles for personal gain. His colleagues sometimes called him Saint Marcus behind his back, but he wore the nickname as a badge of honor rather than shame. Marcus lived modestly in a small house in Millbrook's middle-class Oakwood district with his wife Sarah and their twin children, Michael and Emma, both 17 and preparing for college. Sarah worked as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, and their combined incomes provided a comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle. They drove reliable but aging cars, took vacations to state parks rather than exotic destinations, and saved every penny they could for their children's education. The Kane family represented everything that was still good about public service. They lived within their means, contributed to their community, and never forgot that their purpose was to serve others rather than themselves. Marcus coached youth baseball on weekends. Sarah volunteered at the free clinic, and both teenagers were honor students who planned to follow their parents into public service careers. The 14th precinct sat in the heart of Millbrook, a city where the wealthy districts gleamed with prosperity while the forgotten neighborhoods rotted from neglect. Marcus had worked every corner of this urban jungle, from domestic disputes in subsidized housing to white-collar crime in glass towers. He knew the streets, knew the players, and most importantly, he knew when something wasn't right. The first sign of trouble came on a humid Tuesday morning in March. Marcus was reviewing case files when Captain Raymond Torino called him into his office. Torino was a mountain of a man, his Italian heritage evident in his thick accent and animated gestures. He'd run the precinct with an iron fist for 15 years, and Marcus respected him despite their occasional disagreements about procedure. "Kane, we've got a situation in the Riverside district," Torino said, sliding a manila folder across his desk. 3 drug busts in the past month, all clean, all by the book. Problem is, the evidence keeps coming up short. Marcus opened the folder and studied the reports. Detective Jimmy Castellanos had led all 3 operations, assisted by officers Derek Reeves and Tony Marchetti. The busts had netted significant quantities of cocaine and heroin, but somehow only a fraction of what was initially cataloged made it to the evidence room. "You thinking inside job?" Marcus asked. "I'm thinking we need someone I trust to look into it quietly," Torino replied. "These 3 have been tight since the academy. If there's something dirty going on, they'll close ranks fast." Marcus knew the 3 officers in question. Castellanos was a smooth-talking detective with expensive tastes and a gambling problem. Reeves was a former Marine whose transition to civilian policing had been rocky at best. Marchetti was the enforcer type, quick with his fists and quicker to anger. They'd formed their own little clique within the precinct, always backing each other's stories, always seeming to work the most lucrative busts. "I'll handle it discreetly," Marcus promised. What he didn't know was that his promise had just signed his death warrant. The investigation began simply enough. Marcus started by reviewing evidence logs, comparing what was documented at crime scenes with what appeared in storage. The discrepancies were subtle but consistent, always involving drugs, always on cases handled by the trio, and always amounts that could be written off as weighing errors or evaporation. The investigation began simply enough. Marcus started by reviewing evidence logs, comparing what was documented at crime scenes with what appeared in storage. The discrepancies were subtle but consistent, always involving drugs, always on cases handled by the trio, and always amounts that could be written off as weighing errors or evaporation. But Marcus had been a detective long enough to recognize patterns. He began following paper trails, checking arrest records, and, most tellingly, monitoring the financial activities of his 3 colleagues. What he found made his blood run cold. The financial investigation required Marcus to work nights and weekends, using his personal time to dig into public records and banking information. He established relationships with contacts in various financial institutions, people who shared his commitment to justice and were willing to provide information about suspicious transactions. What emerged was a picture of systematic theft and money laundering that went back at least 3 years. The 3 officers had developed an elaborate system for converting stolen drugs into cash, using a network of dealers, money launderers, and corrupt businesses to clean their profits. Castellanos had paid off his considerable gambling debts to some very dangerous people in the span of 6 weeks, debts that Marcus discovered totaled over 200. The detective had been betting on everything from football games to horse races, and his addiction had put him in debt to loan sharks who were known for their violent collection methods. Reeves had purchased a new truck, a boat, and a motorcycle within the same time frame, spending nearly $150 in cash. But more disturbing were the deposits into accounts for his ex-wife and 2 children, money that suggested he was trying to secure their financial future before something happened to him. Marchetti had moved his family from a cramped apartment to a house in the suburbs, but Marcus's investigation revealed that the house was just the tip of the iceberg. The officer had purchased rental properties, invested in legitimate businesses as fronts for money laundering, and was essentially building a criminal empire using his badge as protection. All of this on police salaries that barely covered basic living expenses. The mathematical impossibility of their lifestyle changes was glaring, but they had been careful to structure their spending in ways that wouldn't immediately trigger financial investigations. The deeper Marcus dug, the clearer the picture became. The 3 weren't just skimming drugs from evidence. They were actively protecting certain dealers while targeting their competition. They were essentially running their own distribution network using police resources and authority. Marcus discovered that the corruption had a structure and hierarchy that resembled a traditional organized crime family. Castellanos acted as the strategist, using his detective skills to identify targets and plan operations. Reeves served as the muscle, intimidating anyone who threatened their operation. Marchetti handled the money, laundering profits through his network of legitimate businesses. But the most chilling discovery was the list of people who had tried to expose them over the years. Marcus found records of 3 other officers who had raised concerns about the trio's activities. One had been transferred to a different precinct after false allegations of misconduct. Another had been involved in a suspicious car accident that ended his career. The third had simply disappeared one night, his case filed as a missing person that was never solved. Marcus realized that he wasn't the first person to stumble onto their operation. He was just the first to survive long enough to gather substantial evidence. The investigation revealed that their network extended throughout the criminal justice system. Judges who consistently gave light sentences to certain defendants. Prosecutors who failed to press charges despite overwhelming evidence. Probation officers who looked the other way when their clients violated parole. Defense attorneys who seemed to know exactly which cases to take and which to avoid. Marcus spent weeks documenting everything, building an airtight case that would not only end their careers but send them to prison for decades. He photographed financial records, recorded suspicious conversations, and traced drug money through a complex network of intermediaries and front businesses. His investigation led him into some of the darkest corners of Millbrook's underworld. He discovered safe houses where stolen drugs were processed and repackaged. He found warehouses where legitimate businesses served as fronts for money laundering operations. He identified a network of corrupt officials that reached into City Hall, the courthouse, and even the mayor's office. But the most disturbing discovery was the human cost of their operation. Marcus found evidence that their protection racket had allowed violent drug dealers to operate with impunity. Murders had gone unsolved because the perpetrators were under their protection. Children had been recruited as drug runners because the corrupt cops ensured they would never be prosecuted. Entire neighborhoods had been abandoned to crime because the police were more interested in profits than protection. The breakthrough came when Marcus discovered that the corruption went deeper than just 3 dirty cops. The drugs they were protecting were being funneled through a network that included judges, prosecutors, and city officials. The 14th precinct wasn't just housing a few bad apples, it was the headquarters of a criminal enterprise that had infected the entire justice system. Marcus realized he was sitting on evidence that could bring down dozens of public officials and reshape the city's power structure. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but his sense of duty was stronger than his fear. He decided to document everything meticulously before taking it to Internal Affairs and the FBI. Marcus rented a storage unit across the city and began copying files, photographs, and recorded conversations. He created multiple backup sets of evidence, storing them in different locations in case something happened to him. His paranoia proved justified when he noticed he was being followed. It started subtly, the same car appearing in his rearview mirror on different routes, familiar faces in restaurants where he'd never seen them before, and a general sense that he was being watched. Marcus had been undercover enough times to recognize surveillance, and he knew that his investigation had been discovered. The psychological pressure was immense. Marcus found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, checking his car for tracking devices, and varying his daily routine to avoid predictable patterns. The stress began to affect his family life. Sarah noticed his distraction and growing paranoia, while Michael and Emma started asking why their father seemed so worried all the time. Marcus couldn't tell them the truth. How could he explain that he was investigating colleagues who had already eliminated other threats to their operation? How could he burden his family with the knowledge that their lives might be in danger because of his investigation? The breaking point came when Marcus discovered that his home phone was being tapped and his personal vehicle had been fitted with a GPS tracking device. The corruption had reached so deep into the system that his colleagues had access to surveillance equipment and techniques normally reserved for investigating major crimes. Marcus realized that he was no longer just investigating corruption. He was fighting for his life against people who had unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. The question was, how much did they know, and how far were they willing to go to stop him? The answer came on a rainy Thursday evening in late August. Marcus was leaving the storage facility where he kept his evidence when 3 figures emerged from the shadows of the parking lot. Even in the dim light, he recognized Castellanos, Reeves, and Marchetti. "Working late tonight, Marcus?" Castellanos asked, his voice carrying a false friendliness that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Just cleaning out some old stuff," Marcus replied, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. "Funny thing about cleaning," Reeves said, stepping closer. "Sometimes you throw away things that other people might find valuable." Marcus knew the time for pretense was over. "You boys want to tell me what this is about." Marchetti, always the most direct of the 3, smiled coldly. "We know what you've been doing, Kane. All those late nights, all that paperwork, all those questions. You've been a busy little Boy Scout." The confrontation that Marcus had been dreading for weeks was finally happening. He could see in their eyes that they knew exactly how much he had discovered about their operation. There was no point in denial or misdirection. They had come here to end his investigation permanently. "If you've got something to say it," Marcus challenged, though his heart was pounding with the knowledge that he was outnumbered and outgunned. Castellanos pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a series of photographs, images of him entering and leaving the storage facility, pictures of him photographing documents, shots of him meeting with contacts who could verify his financial investigations. But most chilling were the photos of his family. Sarah leaving the hospital after her shift, Michael and Emma walking to school, all three of them at home in moments when they thought they were safe and unobserved. "Nice family you've got there, Marcus," Reeves said quietly. "Real nice. Would hate to see anything happen to them because their husband and father couldn't mind his own business." The threat hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had known that his own life was in danger, but the idea that they would threaten his family crossed a line that filled him with both terror and rage. "Here's what's going to happen," Castellanos explained. "You're going to walk away from whatever crusade you think you're on. You're going to destroy whatever evidence you've collected, and you're going to keep your mouth shut about things that don't concern you." "And if I don't?" The three men exchanged glances, and Marcus saw something in their eyes that chilled him to the bone. These weren't just corrupt cops trying to cover their tracks. They were desperate men who had crossed lines they couldn't uncross, and they were willing to do anything to protect themselves. "Let's just say that being a cop in this city has gotten a lot more dangerous lately," Reeves said. "Lot of good officers getting hurt in the line of duty. Would hate to see you become another statistic." Marcus felt the walls closing in around him, but his resolve only strengthened. He'd spent his entire adult life serving justice, and he wasn't about to stop now because some crooked cops were threatening him. "I'll think about what you said," he lied, buying himself time. "Don't think too long," Marchetti warned. "We'd hate for you to overthink yourself into a dangerous situation." The three men melted back into the shadows, leaving Marcus alone in the parking lot, with the weight of their threat hanging over him like a storm cloud. He knew then that he was running out of time, and that his life was now in immediate danger. That night, Marcus made copies of all his evidence and prepared detailed letters explaining his investigation to the FBI, Internal Affairs, and several journalists he trusted. He sealed everything in separate packages and arranged for them to be mailed if he didn't check in with an answering service every 24 hours. But Marcus also made another decision that night. He wrote letters to his wife and children, explaining everything he had discovered and why he couldn't walk away from his investigation. He told them how much he loved them, how proud he was of the people they had become, and how sorry he was that his commitment to justice had put them all in danger. The letters were sealed and placed in a safe deposit box along with copies of all his evidence. If something happened to him, Sarah would know the truth about why he died and what he had been fighting for. Marcus spent a sleepless night sitting in his home office, looking at photographs of his family and wondering if he was making the right choice. Part of him wanted to destroy the evidence, quit the force, and move his family somewhere safe. But every time he considered backing down, he thought about all the victims of the corruption he had uncovered, the families destroyed by drugs, the innocent people sent to prison, the communities abandoned to crime. His precautions proved prophetic. The next morning, Marcus arrived at work to find his desk had been searched and his computer accessed. Files were missing, and it was clear that someone with administrative access had tried to erase his digital footprints. The corruption reached higher than he'd imagined, and he realized that even Captain Torino might be compromised. The realization that he couldn't trust anyone in the department was devastating. Marcus had spent his entire career believing in the institution of law enforcement, trusting his colleagues and superiors to share his commitment to justice. Now he understood that the corruption was so pervasive that he was completely alone in his fight. Marcus spent the day acting normally while planning his next move. He knew he needed to get his evidence to federal authorities immediately before his colleagues could eliminate him and destroy everything he'd worked to gather. But he also knew that any move he made would be monitored and anticipated. The trap was closing around him and his options were running out. But as he prepared to leave work that evening, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Storage Unit 247. Come alone. We have something that belongs to you." Marcus knew it was a trap, but he also knew they had found his evidence cache. Everything he'd worked for, All the proof of the conspiracy that could bring justice to dozens of victims was potentially in their hands. He had no choice but to go. The storage facility was nearly empty when Marcus arrived just after sunset. The orange glow of streetlights cast long shadows between the rows of metal buildings, creating a maze of darkness perfect for an ambush. Marcus approached Unit 247 with his weapon drawn, knowing that he was walking into a trap, but unable to see any alternative. The unit was open, and inside he could see stacks of files and boxes, his evidence carefully arranged like bait in a snare. As he stepped closer, powerful floodlights suddenly blazed from multiple directions, blinding him temporarily. "Drop your weapon, Kane." The voice belonged to Castellanos, though Marcus couldn't see him through the harsh glare of the lights. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then let his pistol fall to the concrete floor. "Smart choice," Reeves said, stepping into view. "Now step into the unit." Marcus complied, his eyes adjusting enough to see that his three colleagues had positioned themselves strategically around the small space. They were all armed, and from their body language, Marcus could tell they had moved beyond threats to actual violence. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Castellanos asked, shaking his head with what appeared to be genuine regret. 22 years on the force, and you had to go and develop a conscience." "The conscience was always there," Marcus replied. "The difference is, I never compromised it for money." Marchetti stepped forward aggressively. "You self-righteous piece of—" "Easy, Tony," Castellanos interrupted. "No need to make this personal. Marcus here is just a man who forgot which side he was on." "I'm on the side of the law," Marcus said. "The law?" Reeves laughed bitterly. "The law is whatever we say it is. We are the law in this city. Judges, prosecutors, city council, they all play by our rules because we make it worth their while." "And what about the people you're supposed to protect?" Marcus asked. "What about the communities being destroyed by the drugs you're pushing?" "What about them?" Castellanos shrugged. "They were already destroyed. We're just making a living off the ruins." Marcus realized then that these men had lost more than their integrity. They had lost their humanity. They no longer saw themselves as public servants or protectors. They were predators who happened to wear badges. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. The three men exchanged glances, and Marcus saw the decision being made without words. He had hoped, even at this moment, that they might just threaten him again, might try to buy him off or scare him into silence, but he could see in their eyes that they had moved beyond such half measures. "Now we clean up our mess," Marchetti said, pulling out a red plastic gasoline container. The smell hit Marcus immediately, sharp, chemical, terrifying in its implications. He had expected a bullet, quick and clean, but they were planning something far worse. "This has to look right," Castellanos explained, almost apologetically. "Heroic detective dies in storage facility fire while investigating drug trafficking. Very tragic. Very believable." "You'll never get away with this," Marcus said, though even as he spoke, he realized how hollow the words sounded. "Get away with what?" Reeves asked. "By tomorrow morning, there won't be any evidence that you ever investigated us. Your computer files are already gone. These documents will burn with you, and 3 upstanding police officers will be devastated by the loss of their colleague." Marchetti began splashing gasoline around the storage unit, the fumes making Marcus's eyes water. The reality of his situation was becoming horrifyingly clear. He was going to die, and his death would be used to cover up the very crimes he had tried to expose. "Any last words?" Castellanos asked, pulling out a lighter. Marcus looked at each of them, these men who had sworn the same oath he had, who had once been entrusted with protecting the innocent. "Yeah," he said, "I feel sorry for you." Castellanos flicked the lighter. The flames erupted with a whoosh that seemed to suck all the air from the storage unit. Marcus screamed as the fire raced up his gasoline-soaked uniform, the pain beyond anything he had ever experienced. Through the agony, he could see his 3 colleagues backing away from the inferno, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow. But Marcus Kane had one final card to play. Before coming to the storage facility, he had activated a digital recording app on his phone and placed it in his jacket pocket. Even as the flames consumed his body, The device continued recording, capturing every word of the confession his killers had unwittingly provided. The phone's automatic cloud backup had been uploading their conversation in real time to a secure server. By the time the flames reached the device and destroyed it, their admission of guilt had already been transmitted to multiple locations. Marcus died, knowing that justice would still be served, though not in the way he had planned. The three corrupt officers watched the fire consume both their colleague and what they believed was the only evidence of their crimes. They waited until the flames had reduced everything to ash and charred metal before calling the fire department, playing the role of concerned officers who had arrived too late to save their friend. The response to the scene was carefully orchestrated. Castellanos called in the fire as a officer-down emergency, ensuring maximum response from both fire and police departments. By the time the first responders arrived, the three had positioned themselves as the discoverers of the tragedy, claiming they had come to check on Marcus after he failed to respond to radio calls. The fire department's investigation was perfunctory. Storage facilities were known fire hazards, and accidents were common. The presence of gasoline was explained as fuel for landscaping equipment that Marcus had supposedly been storing. The intensity of the fire had destroyed most physical evidence, leaving investigators with little to examine. The official investigation concluded exactly what they had planned. Detective Marcus Kane had died heroically while investigating a drug trafficking operation. The story they crafted was that Marcus had been meeting an informant at the storage facility when drug dealers ambushed him, setting the fire to destroy evidence and eliminate a threat to their operation. The narrative was compelling and fit the known facts. Marcus had been investigating drug trafficking. He had been working alone and secretively. The storage facility was in a remote area perfect for criminal activity. The fire had been intense enough to suggest accelerants were used. Every detail supported the story of a dedicated detective who had died in the line of duty. He was posthumously awarded the department's highest honor, and his funeral was attended by hundreds of law enforcement officers who praised his dedication and sacrifice. The ceremony was held at Millbrook's largest church, with bagpipers playing Amazing Grace and a 21-gun salute honoring his service. Sarah Kane stood at the graveside with Michael and Emma, accepting the folded flag from Captain Torino and listening to speeches about her husband's heroism. She had no idea that the men eulogizing Marcus were the same ones who had murdered him, or that their tears were performances rather than genuine grief. Castellanos, Reeves, and Marchetti gave tearful interviews about their fallen colleague, describing him as a brother and a true servant of justice. They spoke passionately about how Marcus had inspired them to be better officers, how his dedication had made them all want to work harder and serve their community more effectively. They established a scholarship fund in his name and spoke passionately about continuing his fight against crime and corruption. The Marcus Kane Memorial Scholarship would help young people from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue careers in law enforcement, ensuring that his legacy of service would continue for generations. The irony was lost on no one except those who knew the truth. The three officers who had killed Marcus Kane were now positioning themselves as the guardians of his memory and the inheritors of his mission. For 6 months, they believed they had gotten away with murder. The recording surfaced during a federal investigation into municipal corruption that had been triggered by an anonymous tip. The FBI had been monitoring communications from Marcus's phone account and discovered the cloud-backed audio file that captured the entire confession. The arrests came simultaneously at dawn on a Tuesday morning. Federal agents stormed the homes of Castellanos, Reeves, and Marchetti, along with 17 other city officials who had been implicated in the conspiracy. The investigation revealed a network of corruption that had operated for over a decade, involving millions of dollars in drug money and affecting hundreds of criminal cases. But even as justice finally caught up with Marcus Kane's killers, the damage they had done was irreversible. Dozens of wrongful convictions had to be overturned. Hundreds of cases were compromised. The faith of an entire community in their police department was shattered. The investigation revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that Marcus had died trying to expose. Federal agents found evidence of over 300 cases that had been compromised by corruption. Drug dealers, who should have been imprisoned, were walking free. Innocent people had been framed to protect criminal operations. Evidence had been planted, witnesses intimidated, and justice perverted on an industrial scale. The financial investigation revealed that the conspiracy had generated over $50 million in illegal profits over a 5-year period. The money had been laundered through dozens of businesses and bank accounts, creating a complex web of financial relationships that took federal investigators years to unravel completely. But the human cost was even more staggering. Families had been destroyed by drugs that corrupt police had allowed to flow freely through their communities. Children had lost parents to violence that could have been prevented. Witnesses had been killed to protect criminal operations. Entire neighborhoods had been written off as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of illegal profits. Captain Torino, who had genuinely been unaware of the extent of the corruption, was forced to resign in disgrace. The investigation revealed that his ignorance had been willful. There had been numerous warning signs that he had chosen to ignore because addressing them would have been inconvenient and politically damaging. The 14th Precinct was disbanded and reorganized under federal oversight. Every officer was subjected to polygraph examinations and financial investigations. Those who couldn't prove their innocence were terminated or transferred. The physical building was closed and eventually demolished, as if the corruption had contaminated the very walls. The city paid millions in settlements to victims of the conspiracy. Families of people who had been wrongfully imprisoned received compensation that could never truly restore what they had lost. Communities that had been abandoned to crime received funding for new programs and initiatives, though the money couldn't bring back the lives that had been lost. But perhaps the most tragic consequence was the loss of trust between the police and the community they were supposed to serve. Even officers who had never been involved in corruption found themselves viewed with suspicion and hostility. The badge that had once been a symbol of protection became a reminder of betrayal. Castellanos, Reeves, and Marchetti were convicted of murder, conspiracy, drug trafficking, and corruption. They each received life sentences without the possibility of parole. In their final statements before sentencing, none of them showed remorse for killing Marcus Kane. They only expressed regret at being caught. The 3 men who had once sworn to protect and serve spent their remaining years in federal prison, surrounded by the very criminals they had once helped put away. They discovered that their former colleagues in law enforcement had no sympathy for corrupt cops, and their time behind bars was neither easy nor safe. Marcus Kane's sacrifice had ultimately exposed the corruption he died fighting, but the cost was devastating. His widow, Sarah, struggled with grief and financial hardship. The police pension she received was barely enough to cover basic expenses, and she was forced to work extra shifts at the hospital to support her family. The psychological impact on the Kane family was profound and lasting. Sarah battled depression and anxiety, haunted by the knowledge that her husband had been murdered by his own colleagues. She struggled with feelings of betrayal and anger, not just toward his killers, but toward the entire system that had failed to protect him. Michael and Emma Kane faced their own challenges. As the children of a martyred police officer, they were expected to be proud of their father's sacrifice. But learning the truth about his murder filled them with anger and confusion. Michael, who had planned to follow his father into law enforcement, abandoned his dream and instead studied journalism, determined to expose corruption wherever he found it. Emma channeled her grief into activism, becoming involved in police reform movements and victims' rights organizations. She spoke publicly about the need for accountability and transparency in law enforcement, using her father's story as an example of what could happen when good cops tried to fight corruption from within. His 2 teenage children grew up without their father, carrying the weight of his heroism alongside the trauma of his murder. They learned to live with the contradiction of being proud of what their father had stood for, while being horrified by what had been done to him. The financial pressure on the family was relentless. Sarah had to take out loans to pay for the children's college education, money that should have come from Marcus's police pension if he had lived to retire. The family was forced to sell their home and move to a smaller apartment, a constant reminder of what they had lost. But perhaps most painful was the way their grief was manipulated by the very people who had killed Marcus. For months, Castellanos, Reeves, and Marchetti visited the family, offering support and comfort while secretly celebrating their successful cover-up. They attended family dinners, helped with household repairs, and even contributed to the children's college funds, all while knowing they were responsible for the family's suffering. The city of Millbrook slowly rebuilt its police department and its relationship with the community, but the scars ran deep. Citizens who had once trusted their officers now viewed them with suspicion. Crime rates increased as witnesses became reluctant to cooperate with authorities they no longer trusted. Years later, a memorial plaque was installed in the lobby of the rebuilt precinct, honoring Detective Marcus Kane's sacrifice. The inscription read, "In memory of those who gave their lives in service of justice." But for those who knew the real story, the memorial served as a reminder of how easily justice could be corrupted and how high the price of integrity could be. Marcus Kane had believed in the system he served, even when that system betrayed him. His death proved that sometimes the thin blue line isn't a barrier against chaos. Sometimes it's the thing that needs to be crossed to reach the truth. In the end, justice was served, but it came too late for the man who had devoted his life to it. The flames that consumed Detective Marcus Kane had also illuminated the darkness that had consumed his department, but the light came at a price that should never have been paid. The case became a cautionary tale taught in police academies across the country, a reminder that the badge is only as honorable as the person who wears it. But for the Kane family, and for the community that had been betrayed by those sworn to protect it, the lesson came too late and cost too much. Marcus Kane died as he had lived, in service of justice. But his death proved that sometimes being a hero means paying the ultimate price for doing what's right, even when the system you serve has forgotten what right means. The flames had consumed more than just one good cop. They had burned away the illusion that justice is always served, that good always triumphs, and that those who fight for what's right are always protected by the very system they defend. In the ashes of that storage unit lay not just the remains of Detective Marcus Kane, but the shattered faith of a community that had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes the only thing standing between justice and corruption is the courage of one person willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. And sometimes, even that isn't enough. Subscribe and like if you enjoyed the video.